I never imagined I'd be the protagonist of such a twisted story. 40 years of marriage. 2 grown sons. A house built brick by brick, where every corner held memories of a shared life. But that night, all those years crumbled into dust. I came home earlier than expected. The evening air was cool, and I thought of surprising Caroline with dinner. As I entered through the side door, I noticed the faint glow of light spilling from the living room. It was unusual. Caroline had told me she'd be spending the evening reading upstairs. The sound of laughter reached my ears, soft but intimate. I stopped. My heartbeat quickened, but I pushed aside the unease. I walked slowly, silently, toward the living room door. What I saw froze me in place. Caroline was sitting on the couch, leaning close to Tommy, my son's best friend, a man who'd eaten at my table, laughed at my jokes, and acted as though he respected me. She held his hand, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. And then, he leaned in and kissed her. My jaw tightened. A lesser man might have crumbled, walked away to cry in silence, or worse, begged for explanations. Not me. I stepped forward, throwing open the door with enough force to make it slam against the wall. What the hell is this? My voice was cold, controlled, yet every word cut like a knife. Caroline gasped, pulling her hand away from Tommy as if burned. Tommy stuttered, his face draining of color, looking less like a man and more like the coward he was. I pointed at the door. You. Out. Now. Tommy stood frozen, his lips moving but no words coming out. I said out. My voice thundered. He stumbled, his head down, and bolted past me like a guilty dog. Caroline began to speak. Mike, it's not. Don't. Just don't. I held up a hand to silence her. She froze, tears already forming in her eyes. Mike, it was just. Save your excuses. You just threw 40 years of marriage into the gutter for what? Attention? Excitement? My voice dripped with disgust. You couldn't handle stability, could you? Women like you crave chaos. You'd burn everything to the ground just to feel something. I pulled out my phone and began recording the scene. If you think this ends here, you're mistaken. This isn't just between us anymore, Caroline. I'm making sure the world knows who you are and what you've done. Her face twisted in panic. Mike, please, don't do this. We can talk. Talk? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You made your choices, Caroline. Now live with the consequences. Tomorrow, you're leaving this house. And believe me, I'll make sure you have nowhere to crawl back to. I turned on my heel, walking out of the room and slamming the door behind me. My mind was already working, planning. I wasn't just going to end this marriage, I was going to ensure she felt the weight of her betrayal every single day. As I closed the door to the living room, my mind burned with one thought, they would pay. Both of them. I walked to my study, slamming the door behind me. For years, this room had been my sanctuary, a space where I planned vacations, reviewed our finances, and dreamed of the life Caroline and I had built together. Now it was my war room. I sat at my desk, pulled out my laptop, and started a folder titled Evidence. The first file? A short video clip from my phone of Caroline's panicked face and Tommy's cowardly retreat. This wasn't enough. I needed more. The next morning, I called a security company and had a technician come out under the pretense of upgrading our home system. By the time Caroline returned from wherever she had run off to, there were discrete cameras installed in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. Upgrading security, I said flatly when she asked about the changes. Her face paled, but she didn't say another word. That same day, I checked her phone records. Years of sharing a life meant I knew her passcode, our anniversary date. With a few swipes, I found what I needed: frequent calls and texts to Tommy. The conversations were short and guarded, but one message stood out. I miss you. Can't wait until we have the house to ourselves again. The words hit me like a punch, but I saved the screenshot. Every detail would be used against her. Over the next week, I played the part of the silent, seething husband. Caroline avoided me as much as she could, but she wasn't clever enough to suspect what I was doing. I used her absence to dig further. Emails? Found several exchanged with Tommy, cleverly hidden under a work alias. Photos? Nothing explicit, but their proximity in selfies said it all. Every piece of evidence went into the folder. The cameras caught them meeting again when I conveniently left for errands. Caroline welcomed Tommy with a smile and a kiss, and they sat in my living room like it belonged to them. Watching it made my blood boil, but I kept my calm. The time for confrontation would come, and I'd be ready. One evening, as Caroline tried to make small talk during dinner, I interrupted. Don't bother, I said, my voice cold. I know everything. Her fork clattered onto her plate, and her face drained of color. What are you talking about? I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. You. Tommy. The texts. The meetings in my house. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Her lip trembled, but I didn't let her speak. Save your excuses. From this moment on, things are going to change. You will not touch a penny from our accounts. You will not step foot in this house without my permission. And you will not speak to Tommy again, or I will make sure the world knows exactly what you've been up to. Caroline burst into tears, but I felt nothing. This wasn't the time for forgiveness or pity. This was the beginning of the end for her. I didn't sleep that night. Every minute in the dark, I pieced together how I'd dismantle the life Caroline and Tommy thought they could have. She was restless too, pacing the bedroom like a caged animal. I didn't say a word to her. Her guilt was her prison now. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Years of running my own business had taught me to prepare for the worst, and I had kept a top-tier divorce attorney on retainer. I scheduled a meeting for the following day, making it clear I wanted full control of the house and all assets. Caroline would leave with nothing more than her personal belongings. I wasn't content with just a divorce. Divorce was easy, it would let her walk away too cleanly. No, I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal. Tommy had his own ambitions, politics. He was gearing up to run for city council, playing the role of a wholesome, community-driven young man. His campaign posters even had a photo of him shaking my hand at one of our family events. The hypocrisy made my blood boil. I contacted a few acquaintances in local media. A scandal like this would sell, and I knew exactly how to feed it to them. Photos, texts, and video recordings of Tommy and Caroline, nothing too graphic, but enough to ruin his carefully constructed image. That evening, I sat Caroline down at the dining table. You need to pack, I said bluntly. Her eyes filled with tears. Mike, I don't care what you have to say. You will leave this house tomorrow. My lawyer will be in touch with the terms. You won't get a penny more than you deserve, nothing. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice trembling. Not my problem, I replied coldly. You made your bed. Now go lie in it, preferably somewhere far from me. Caroline broke down in sobs, but I didn't feel pity. I felt free. The following week, I executed the final phase of my plan. The media leak worked like a charm. Tommy's campaign was dead in the water within 48 hours. His photos with Caroline became the talk of the town, and his reputation crumbled. He released a half-hearted apology, but it only fueled the fire. Caroline tried to reach out to me several times, but I ignored her calls. She begged through messages, saying she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to make things right. There was no going back. I sold the house. Too many memories haunted its walls, and I didn't need them. With the proceeds, I bought a small property by the lake, peaceful, isolated, exactly what I needed. On my last night in the house, I sat in the empty living room with a glass of whiskey. I thought about the life I'd built, the woman I had trusted, and the years I couldn't get back. This was never about losing you, I said aloud, though the room was empty. It was about reclaiming myself. I raised the glass to my lips and smiled for the first time in months. Moving out of the house felt like shedding old skin. It wasn't just about leaving a building behind, it was leaving behind memories, both good and bad. I closed the door for the last time without looking back. The house where I had raised my sons and shared decades of my life with Caroline had turned into a prison of betrayal. My new home by the lake wasn't just a new chapter, it was a declaration of freedom. But I wasn't finished. No, Caroline and Tommy still had more to answer for. Humiliation at the family gathering was just the first blow. Their actions had consequences, and I was determined to make sure those consequences reached them both. A week after the media storm surrounding Tommy erupted, I decided to check on the damage firsthand. There was a community event he had been planning as part of his campaign for city council, a cleanup drive at the local park. I hadn't planned on showing up, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, the scene was exactly what I expected, a disaster. There were only a handful of people milling around, most of them disinterested volunteers who clearly had no idea what they were supposed to be doing. Tommy stood near a small booth, handing out flyers that nobody wanted to take. His face looked haggard, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of his failure. He caught sight of me as I stood a short distance away. His eyes widened, and his hand froze mid-motion, still clutching a flyer. I smiled, not warmly, but with the kind of smug satisfaction that let him know I was enjoying every second of this. Raising the coffee cup in my hand, I gave him a slight nod, like I was toasting to his misery. Then, without saying a word, I turned and walked away. I didn't need to confront him directly. The damage was done. His political aspirations were in ruins, and every step he took would now be under the shadow of the scandal I'd exposed. I knew that look in his eyes. He was wondering what else I might do, what other cards I had to play. The truth was, I didn't need to do anything else. He was finished, and he knew it. Caroline, however, was harder to ignore. The voicemails started almost immediately after she moved out. At first, they were tearful pleas for forgiveness, her voice cracking as she begged me to reconsider and give her a chance to make things right. When I didn't respond, her tone shifted. The messages became angrier, accusing me of being unfair, of not caring about the years we'd spent together. It was almost laughable, hearing her try to twist her betrayal into my fault. But the breaking point came when she showed up at my office unannounced. My assistant tried to stop her, but Caroline stormed past her and barged into my office, her face flushed and her eyes wild with desperation. "Mike, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just hear me out." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my stomach as I stared at her. "Talk? Now you want to talk? Where was this need to talk before you decided to bring another man into our house? Into my life?" Her lip quivered, and tears began to form in her eyes. "I made a mistake," she whispered. I straightened up, my voice cutting through her like a blade. "A mistake is forgetting to take out the trash. A mistake is being late to a meeting. What you did wasn't a mistake, Caroline. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice to betray me, to betray our family." She flinched, her composure cracking under the weight of my words. "I was lonely," she stammered. "You were always so busy." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I worked hard to give you and our family the life you wanted. I trusted you. And what did you do with that trust? You threw it away for a cheap thrill with someone half your age." Her tears were flowing freely now, but I felt nothing. No pity, no regret, just a cold, unshakable certainty that I was doing the right thing. "This conversation is over," I said, standing and pointing toward the door. "Get out. And the next time you need to say something to me, you can do it through my lawyer." She hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say more. But then she turned and walked out without another word. 2 months later, the divorce was finalized. As planned, I kept the majority of our assets, leaving Caroline with only what the court mandated. She moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the life of comfort she had once enjoyed. From what I heard, she struggled to find steady work. The scandal had stained her reputation just as much as Tommy's. For me, life moved on. My lake house became a sanctuary, a place where I could rebuild myself. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a rare sense of peace. A knock at the door broke my reverie. When I opened it, my eldest son stood there, holding a bottle of bourbon. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. We sat in silence for a while before he spoke. "You did the right thing, Dad. Mom, she made her choices. None of this is on you." I nodded, clinking my glass against his. The betrayal had broken something in me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I had rebuilt, stronger than before. And I knew I would never let anyone take that away from me again. The weeks following the divorce were surprisingly quiet. I thought I'd feel some kind of hollow victory or maybe an emptiness from ending a 40-year marriage. Instead, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. The house by the lake had become my sanctuary, but I wasn't foolish enough to think that the echoes of betrayal would disappear so easily. Caroline, despite being legally out of my life, couldn't seem to let go. The messages hadn't stopped entirely, though now they were rare and desperate. Each one carried the same pleading tone, the same empty promises of change. But I knew better. People like her didn't change, they just regretted the consequences of their choices. One evening, as I was sitting by the lake, I heard my phone buzz. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. "We need to talk. Please. For the sake of the family." The audacity almost made me laugh. For the sake of the family? She had already ripped that apart. I ignored it, tossing the phone onto the patio table beside me. The family didn't need fixing, it needed healing, and that was something she couldn't offer. But the text lingered in my mind longer than I'd have liked. I stared out at the water, the ripples reflecting the dimming light of the evening. My thoughts drifted back to how we'd built our family. The holidays, the birthdays, even the arguments that always ended with an apology and laughter. Those memories weren't hers to destroy. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out weeks ago, leaving behind something colder and sharper, a resolve. I had done everything I could to make sure Caroline and Tommy felt the sting of their actions. But there was still one loose thread I hadn't addressed. The following morning, I made a few phone calls. Tommy might have retreated into obscurity, but that didn't mean he was untouchable. I still had contacts in the community, and it didn't take long to learn that he was trying to quietly rebuild his life. He'd taken a job at a private firm, far from the public eye, but I also learned he had started dating someone new. That detail didn't surprise me. Men like Tommy thrived on manipulation, and I doubted his new relationship would end any differently than the mess he'd left with Caroline. The thought made me pause. Caroline. I realized I hadn't thought about how she was faring in weeks. The apartment she'd moved into was modest at best, and word had it she was struggling to adjust. I felt no satisfaction in her misery. I'd already taken everything I wanted from her. But Tommy? He still had more to lose. I decided to pay him a visit. Not at work, that would be too easy, but at the small coffee shop where he'd been spotted with his new girlfriend. I arrived early, took a seat in the corner, and waited. When he walked in, arm in arm with a young woman who couldn't have been older than 25, I felt a pang of something I hadn't expected, a pity. She had no idea who he was or what he'd done. But that pity was fleeting, quickly replaced by the same cold resolve that had carried me through this entire ordeal. As they sat down, I approached their table. Tommy froze when he saw me, his face going pale. "Hello, Tommy," I said, keeping my voice even but firm. "Mind if I join you?" The girl looked confused, glancing between us. Tommy stammered something unintelligible, but I ignored him, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Don't worry," I said to her, offering a thin smile. "This won't take long." Turning back to Tommy, I leaned in slightly. "You didn't think I'd forgotten about you, did you? I wanted to make sure you understood something very clearly. You don't just get to walk away from what you did. Actions have consequences, and yours are far from over." Tommy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The girl looked increasingly uncomfortable, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Does she know?" I asked, nodding toward her. "Does she know who you really are? What you're capable of?" "Mike," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "This isn't the place." "No, Tommy, this is exactly the place," I cut him off. "You see, I've been very patient. But patience has its limits." Standing, I looked down at him, my shadow casting over the table. "Stay out of my way. Stay out of my family's lives. And for her sake," I added, glancing at the girl, "learn how to be a better man. Though I doubt you'll succeed." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. The cold air outside felt refreshing, as if it had cleansed me of the lingering bitterness. That night, back at the lake house, I felt a rare sense of peace. The loose ends were tied, and for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. Tommy was just a memory now, a mistake left behind with the rest of the wreckage. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, watching the moonlight dance on the water. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. And that was enough. The day I closed the door to our old house for the last time, it didn't feel like an ending, it felt like a severing. Every step I took away from that house, with its familiar creaks in the floorboards and faded wallpaper, felt heavier than the last. That house had seen everything, the beginnings of a life built together, the raising of 2 sons, the laughter and arguments that filled the halls. But it also carried the weight of betrayal, and I couldn't bear to carry it any longer. The lake house was different. It didn't have ghosts lingering in the corners or memories waiting to ambush me around every turn. It was quiet. Too quiet, at first. Some nights, the silence felt deafening, like it was accusing me of something I couldn't name. But over time, the stillness became a comfort. I started to realize that I wasn't escaping the past, I was giving myself room to rebuild. Weeks turned into months, and my days fell into a rhythm. I'd wake early, sometimes before the sun, and sit on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The mist rolling off the lake in the early morning light had a way of clearing my head. There was something honest about the way the world looked at that hour, stripped of all its distractions. One afternoon, as I worked on fixing the dock, a neighbor passed by, waving as he walked his dog. We exchanged pleasantries, and he paused to chat. It was the kind of idle conversation I'd avoided for a while, small talk about the weather, fishing spots, and local events. At some point, he brought up Tommy. "You know, I heard he's been trying to keep a low profile," the neighbor said, scratching his dog behind the ears. "Lost his job not too long ago. Guess the guy couldn't handle the heat." I gave a noncommittal nod, but inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Tommy thought he could slither away unscathed, but reputations have a way of sticking, especially when you've done everything possible to deserve it. A few nights later, as I sat with a glass of whiskey and watched the stars, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Mike, we need to talk. Please, for the sake of the family." "For the sake of the family?" The hypocrisy was almost laughable. The same woman who had torn our family apart was now trying to invoke it as a reason for me to listen to her? I stared at the message for a moment, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and pity. I didn't reply. There was nothing she could say that would undo what she'd done. The next morning, I decided to go into town for groceries. As I stood in line at the store, an older man behind me struck up a conversation about the unusually warm weather for the season. It was a simple, forgettable exchange, but just as I was about to pay, he asked a question that caught me off guard. "By the way, how's Caroline?" The name hit me like a slap, though I kept my expression neutral. I didn't know this man, and I wasn't about to spill my life story in the checkout line. "She's doing what she can," I said flatly, handing over cash and leaving before he could probe further. It wasn't the first time her name had come up unexpectedly, and it wouldn't be the last. Small-town gossip traveled fast, and no one could resist poking at fresh wounds. But each time, it reminded me why I had fought so hard to cut her out of my life completely. Later that week, an email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "I thought you'd want to see this." Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. Inside was a video of Tommy at some kind of party, clearly drunk, slurring his words as he leaned on a bar counter. "She thought I actually cared," he said, laughing too hard. "Caroline was just, what do you call it? Convenient. Older women are so damn desperate. It's pathetic." The laughter from the group around him rang in my ears long after I closed the video. I wasn't shocked. Tommy's arrogance had always been his defining trait, but hearing the contempt in his voice stirred something in me. I couldn't let it go. By the next morning, I had made a decision. I contacted an old friend who worked in media and passed along the video with a short explanation. Tommy's attempt to rebuild his career had been quiet, but not quiet enough to escape my reach. Within days, the clip was circulating in the same circles that had once praised him. By the end of the week, Tommy was out of another job. That night, as I sat on the porch with a glass in hand, the weight that had clung to me for months began to lift. Tommy and Caroline were nothing more than remnants of a life I no longer recognized. The lake was still, the water reflecting the last traces of the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. The lake stretched out in front of me, its surface reflecting the warm hues of a fading sunset. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the steam curling lazily in the cool evening air. This had become my ritual, watching the day end, letting the stillness of the water calm the storm inside me. It had been months since I'd closed the door to my old life, but pieces of it still lingered like faint echoes. No matter how much I tried to shut it out, reminders of Caroline and Tommy had a way of slipping through the cracks. A text from an unknown number. An offhand comment from someone in town. Even a passing thought that would surface uninvited when I least expected it. I had thought cutting ties would bring closure. Instead, it felt like dragging a heavy chain, every link forged by 40 years of shared memories and the weight of betrayal. One afternoon, as I was repairing the old dock, my phone buzzed from the nearby toolbox. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up, squinting at the screen. David, the caller ID read. "My eldest son." I answered, keeping my voice neutral. "Hey, Dad," he said, a hint of hesitation in his tone. "Can we meet? There's something I need to talk about." We agreed on a diner in town. It was one of those places with vinyl booths and sticky syrup dispensers, the kind of spot where the coffee was always hot but never quite good. When I arrived, David was already there, a mug of coffee in front of him and his phone face down on the table. "Thanks for coming," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "Of course," I replied. "What's on your mind?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's about Mom." I stiffened slightly but said nothing, letting him continue. "She's been calling me," he said, his eyes fixed on the table. "She's struggling, Dad. She doesn't know how to move on, and she keeps asking about you." I leaned back in the booth, crossing my arms. And what does she expect me to do about that? David flinched, as if I'd struck him, but he pressed on. She's not handling things well. I'm not saying you need to forgive her or take her back. I don't know, Dad. I feel stuck in the middle here. I looked at him, my son, a grown man now, yet still caught in the crossfire of choices he didn't make. The anger I had carried for months didn't flare up this time. Instead, there was something else, something quieter. You don't have to pick sides, I said finally. She's your mother, and I'm your father. What you do with her is your decision. But don't expect me to fix what she broke. David nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the conversation had taken something out of him. When I got back to the lake house that evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the water, staring at the reflection of the moon. David's words lingered in my mind, stirring memories I had tried to bury. I thought of Caroline, not the woman who had betrayed me, but the one I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had laughed with me on our wedding day, who had stayed up late comforting me after my father's funeral, who had held my hand when we welcomed our sons into the world. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Not in divorcing her, that had been the right choice, but in letting the bitterness consume me for so long. The next day, I packed up the last box of items I had brought from the old house. A collection of tools, a few books, and an old photo album I hadn't opened in years. I sat on the floor of the living room, the photo album resting in my lap. The first page held a picture of our family, and me, Caroline, and the boys standing on a rocky beach during a summer vacation. We were all smiling, the kind of smiles that felt unbreakable at the time. I traced a finger over the edges of the photo, then closed the album and placed it back in the box. That evening, I received a knock at the door. When I opened it, my youngest son, Eric, stood there with a sheepish grin and a six-pack of beer. Thought I'd stop by, he said, holding up the drinks. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. We spent the evening on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Eric had always been the quieter of the two, but that night he surprised me with his insight. You're handling this better than I thought you would, he said at one point, staring out at the lake. Mom, she messed up, but you didn't let it break you. That's something. His words stayed with me long after he left. The next morning, as the sun rose over the water, I felt something shift. The restlessness that had plagued me for months was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. This was my life now. Not the one I had planned, but the one I had fought for. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The lake had always been quiet at this hour, but tonight it felt different. The usual sounds, the soft chirp of crickets, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, seemed farther away, almost muffled. I sat on the porch with a book in my lap, though I wasn't reading. The words on the page blurred as my thoughts wandered, tangled up in memories I couldn't seem to shake. I ran a hand through my hair, now more gray than brown, and let out a long breath. It was strange how the mind worked. I'd gone weeks without thinking about Caroline, truly thinking about her, and yet here she was, invading my peace. It wasn't anger anymore. That had burned itself out months ago, leaving behind something quieter, harder to define. Regret, maybe? Or just the heavy weight of what could have been? Earlier that day, I'd been in town picking up supplies. Nothing special, just some nails for the dock and a bag of seed for the small patch of wildflowers I'd been trying to cultivate by the side of the house. As I loaded the truck, I noticed her. Evelyn. I hadn't seen her in decades, not since high school. Back then, she was the girl who always had her nose buried in a book, who blushed when called on in class but still managed to give the most thoughtful answers. Seeing her now, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was streaked with silver, and there were faint lines around her eyes, but she carried herself with a quiet grace that made her seem timeless. She was standing by her car, rummaging through her purse with the kind of distracted determination that felt familiar. Evelyn? I called, not entirely sure why I said her name out loud. She turned, and her face lit up with recognition. Mike? Is that really you? I smiled, stepping closer. It's been a while. We ended up at the small cafe across the street, sitting near the window where the afternoon light streamed in, warm and golden. The conversation started slowly, each of us stumbling over the years that had passed between us. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the awkwardness faded. Evelyn told me about her life, her daughters, her late husband, the decision to move back to town after his death. She spoke with a kind of quiet resilience, as if she'd made peace with the pain but hadn't forgotten it. When it was my turn, I hesitated. The words felt heavy in my throat, but Evelyn didn't push. She simply sipped her coffee, waiting. I'm divorced, I said eventually, the words falling flat. It's been complicated. She nodded, her gaze steady. Life usually is. Her response caught me off guard. It wasn't pity, wasn't prying, just an acknowledgement of the messiness we all carry. That evening, back at the lake house, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. Life is complicated. It was such a simple truth, and yet it felt like something I hadn't allowed myself to accept. For months, I'd been clinging to the idea that there was a right way to feel about what had happened. Anger, sadness, bitterness, they had all taken their turns, but none of them had brought me peace. Evelyn's words made me realize something I hadn't been ready to admit, and maybe peace wasn't about finding the right emotion. Maybe it was about letting them all exist and learning to live with them. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the way they had been before. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt less like isolation and more like space to think, to feel, to just be. I found myself looking forward to my trips into town, hoping I might run into Evelyn again. And when I didn't, I caught myself considering whether to call her, something I hadn't done with anyone in years. It wasn't about romance, not exactly. It was about connection. About finding someone who could sit with the silence and not feel the need to fill it. One evening, as I stood by the edge of the dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about Caroline. Not the woman who had betrayed me, but the one I'd built a life with. I thought about the letters she used to write me when I was away on business, her neat handwriting spilling across the pages with stories of her day and the simple words "I miss you." I hadn't thought about those letters in years, but now they floated to the surface of my mind like leaves on the lake. For the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It was just there. The next morning, as the light of dawn spilled across the lake, I felt something shift. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of epiphany you see in movies. It was quieter than that. I stood on the dock, coffee in hand, and watched as the world woke up around me. The past would always be part of me, but it didn't have to define me. For the first time, I felt ready to move forward. The morning started like any other, quiet, with a pale sun rising over the lake. I stood at the edge of the dock, coffee in hand, watching the water. It was so still that it looked like glass, reflecting the sky in muted tones of blue and gray. A bird called out somewhere in the distance, its cry sharp and lonely. I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness ground me. It should have been just another morning, but Evelyn's words kept creeping into my mind. You seem lighter, she'd said. At the time, I didn't know how to respond. Now, standing here with the world so still around me, I wondered if she was right. The day before, I'd gone into town for some supplies. It was supposed to be a quick trip, paint for the dock, a new pair of gloves for yard work, but I found myself lingering near the cafe. Evelyn was there, sitting at a table outside, her notebook open and a pen poised between her fingers. She wasn't writing, though. Instead, she was staring off into the distance, her expression distant but calm. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to disturb her. Another part, one I wasn't quite ready to admit existed, wanted to sit down across from her and talk. Before I could decide, she glanced up and spotted me. Her face lit up with a smile, and the hesitation melted away. "Mike," she called, waving me over. I smiled, walking toward her. "Caught in the middle of something important?" "Hardly," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Just trying to make sense of my thoughts." "You?" "Looking for an excuse to avoid fixing the dock," I said, sitting down. She laughed, the sound light and easy. The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did with Evelyn. We talked about everything and nothing, the books she'd been reading, the stubborn patch of wildflowers I couldn't seem to keep alive, her plans to visit her daughters. At one point, she tilted her head, studying me. "You've changed," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Changed how?" She smiled faintly, setting her pen down. "When we first talked, you seemed heavier, I guess. Like you were carrying something you couldn't quite let go of. But now? You seem lighter." I didn't know what to say to that. For so long, I'd been defined by the weight of the past, by anger, regret, and a constant need to make sense of it all. But maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't carrying as much as I used to. Later that evening, back at the lake house, I found myself digging through an old box I'd ignored for months. It was tucked away in the corner of the storage room, its lid slightly askew as if daring me to open it. Inside were fragments of a life I barely recognized anymore, photo albums, letters, trinkets from trips I could hardly remember. I picked up one of the letters first. It was from Caroline, written during the early years of our marriage when I'd been traveling for work. Her handwriting was neat and precise, the words carefully chosen. "The house feels so empty without you here," it read. "I miss you more than I can say. Come home soon." The words felt foreign now, like they belonged to someone else entirely. I set the letter aside and opened the photo album. The first picture was of Caroline and the boys, taken during a family trip to the coast. She was smiling, her hair windblown, her arms stretched wide as if to embrace the whole world. I stared at the photo for a long time, waiting for the familiar sting of regret or anger. But it didn't come. Instead, there was just a quiet ache, like the echo of a song I hadn't heard in years. The next morning, as I stood on the porch with my coffee, I thought about Evelyn's words again. Lighter. It wasn't a word I would have chosen for myself, but maybe that was why it felt so true. For years, I'd carried the weight of the past, the questions, the blame, the endless cycle of what ifs. But now, standing there with the lake stretched out before me, I realized I didn't need to carry it all anymore. The past was still there, and it always would be. But it didn't define me. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, Evelyn called. Her voice was warm, teasing, as she asked if I'd finally finished fixing the dock. Not even close, I admitted. Well, when you're ready for a break, I know a spot by the river that's perfect for a picnic, she said. What do you think? I hesitated, not because I didn't want to go, but because the idea of saying yes felt new. Unfamiliar in a way that made my chest tighten and my heart beat just a little faster. I'd like that, I said finally. As I packed a small bag for the picnic, I caught my reflection in the mirror by the door. For the first time in years, I didn't see someone weighed down by the past. I saw someone ready for whatever came next. And that, I realized, was enough. The morning had that kind of crispness that made everything seem sharper. The lake shimmered under the sunlight, its surface broken only by the occasional splash of fish. I stood at the edge of the dock, coffee in hand, watching as the mist slowly lifted. For weeks, this dock had been a project I kept putting off. A broken board here, a loose nail there, it wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't quite whole either. Kind of like me, I supposed. I'd always meant to fix it, but there was something comforting about the imperfections. Today, though, the dock didn't feel like something I needed to fix. It just felt like a place to stand, to breathe. I packed lightly for the picnic. Evelyn had been clear, no need to make a fuss. just bring yourself, she'd said with that teasing tone of hers. I'd smiled at the time, but now, as I folded a blanket and tucked it into the bag beside some sandwiches, I wondered if she'd meant something more. The drive to the river was longer than I'd expected. The directions Evelyn had given me were handwritten on a scrap of paper, the kind of details you wouldn't find on a GPS. Turn left at the big oak tree, she'd written. If you pass the fence with the missing planks, you've gone too far. I almost missed the turn, distracted by the sunlight filtering through the trees, but I caught the glint of the fence just in time. When I arrived, Evelyn was already there. She'd chosen a spot under a wide willow tree, its branches dipping low over the water. She waved as I parked, her smile easy and familiar. Perfect timing, she said as I walked over. I was starting to think you got lost. Almost, I admitted, holding up the bag. But I brought supplies, so I figured that makes up for it. We spent the afternoon talking, the conversation as effortless as the river flowing beside us. Evelyn had a way of drawing you out, of making you feel like every word you said mattered. She told me stories about her daughters, their quirks, their struggles, their triumphs, and I found myself sharing more about my life than I had in years. At one point, she poured lemonade from a glass bottle into two mismatched cups. To new beginnings, she said, raising hers. I hesitated for a moment before clinking my cup against hers. To new beginnings, I echoed. The words felt heavier than I expected, not because they were hard to say, but because they carried so much weight. As the afternoon stretched on, we lapsed into silence, both of us watching the river. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the willow branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Do you ever think about the future? Evelyn asked, breaking the quiet. All the time, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. And what do you see? I didn't answer right away. It was a question I'd avoided asking myself for years. But now, sitting beside Evelyn with the river murmuring in the background, it felt like one I could face. I don't know, I said finally. But for the first time, I'm not afraid to find out. She smiled, a small, quiet smile, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. By the time we packed up, the sky had deepened to a rich indigo, the first stars just beginning to peek through. Evelyn walked beside me as we carried everything back to the cars, her steps slow and deliberate. Thanks for today, I said as we reached her car. She turned to me, her expression soft. You don't have to thank me, Mike. I'm glad you came. Before I could say anything else, she stepped closer and kissed my cheek, a light, fleeting touch that left me momentarily breathless. Drive safe, she said, her voice low but steady. The drive home felt different. The road was the same, the trees just as tall, but something inside me had shifted. When I got back to the lake house, I didn't head inside right away. Instead, I walked down to the dock and sat at the edge, my feet dangling just above the water. The moon was bright, its reflection rippling across the surface of the lake. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I wasn't replaying the past or trying to make sense of it. Instead, I was thinking about what might come next. The idea didn't scare me the way it used to. It didn't feel heavy or out of reach. It just felt possible. I smiled, the cool night air brushing against my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. Ready to begin again.